On April 26, 1989, Dragon Ball Z began, and since then, it's been 35 years of an international phenomenon unlike almost any other in the history of fiction. Manga, anime, movies, video games, endless merchandise have all been spawned from the success of Dragon Ball Z, and the series has been translated into so many languages since then, you would think it's like some kind of religious movement. But that's how popular Dragon Ball Z is. What is the secret history of Dragon Ball Z? How did this whole thing start? Was it just from the pen of Toriyama in the manga, or were there other players? On this edition of Dragon Ball In Depth, we take you back to the late 80s when changes were being made as the Z era was about to begin. We're going to debunk a lot of myths, and we're going to go and tell you the true story of the birth of Dragon Ball Z. I don't care where you're from. I don't care what version you like. This is a must-see video. Watch it till the end. Leave a like right now and sit back because I promise you, you will have a good time. Let's go. The first thing that must be established is where this whole thing began. And this whole thing began in 1984 when Akira Toriyama created a manga called Dragon Ball. At the time, he was already a huge success thanks to his seminal Dr. Slump work, which received an anime adaptation in 1981 and catapulted Toriyama to multi-millionaire status. At one time, he was one of the wealthiest Japanese men in the country and one of the most famous. It must be understood that there is really no Dragon Ball Z manga. If you read the original Japanese manga, whether it be the Tankobon or the Kanzenban or any of the other releases, Dragon Ball is one big story from the Pilaf arc all the way through to Majin Buu. The name Dragon Ball Z only exists in anime form, even though some international translations of the manga, like for example the Viz English translation, separate the Dragon Ball and the Z portion of the series, primarily because when they were releasing the manga in the late 90s, early 2000s, the brand name of Dragon Ball Z had taken off in the West, primarily due to its incredible run on the Toonami block, which is probably why most of you are here. Remember, the manga was released first in Japan, so people were familiar with the original story before it was adapted into an anime. After a couple years of chapters running weekly in the Shonen Jump magazine, Toei Animation, the same company that produced Dr. Slump, came to Shueisha and Toriyama to discuss adapting the series for television as an anime, and that's how the Dragon Ball anime was born. As the anime was running on Fuji Television every Wednesday night at 7 p.m., Toriyama was writing the manga, with new chapters every single week ahead of the anime story. Of course, as many of you remember, with America and the westernization of Dragon Ball, it wasn't quite the same thing. Funimation dubbed the first 13 episodes of the original Dragon Ball before skipping all the way to Dragon Ball Z and later returning to dub the remainder of Dragon Ball and redo those original 13 episodes once Dragon Ball Z had become a big hit on Toonami. This was done for a lot of different corporate reasons, mostly because there were internal discussions about Dragon Ball Z being shifted into being a science fiction action show. So for kids back in the 90s who were watching Dragon Ball Z on TV, you were only getting the second 2/3 of the story pretty much. And thus a lot of context was missing. However, in Japan and in most other countries, the original Dragon Ball ran for a number of years, with its final episode airing on April 19th, 1989. The very next week, in the exact same time slot, Dragon Ball Z would begin with its very first episode, April 26th, 1989. But even though the anime was named Dragon Ball Z, the manga still remained just being called Dragon Ball all the way through to the end. However, in America, Viz chose to split the two parts of the series just like the anime did so that they could simultaneously release volumes for Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball to put the story out faster. This is because Dragon Ball Z became a massive hit in America, so it was a business strategy to brand the manga as Z, even though it wasn't that way in Japan. And I think because of this, a lot of Dragon Ball fans get this wrong. I think a lot of Dragon Ball fans, especially the ones who have never actually watched the series from start to finish or read the series from start to finish, mistakenly believe that Dragon Ball Z is more of an action-oriented show and that's the show where you have the bigger explosions, the crazy transformations, and the most epic battles, and Dragon Ball is the Kid Goku comedy story. And while that's not entirely incorrect, it's also far from the truth. It wasn't like Toriyama had intended a hard dividing line where he said that Dragon Ball Z will be more science fiction based and the battles will be bigger and Dragon Ball would be more based in fantasy. That never happened. If you study the series, you come to realize that it was more of a gradual change. The first few chapters of Dragon Ball are a bit more comedic, and then slowly as we delve into the Red Ribbon Army and Demon King Piccolo arcs, things get darker and darker. And by the time we get to the Demon King Piccolo finale, it feels just as much like any Dragon Ball Z battle as any other fight in Dragon Ball Z. It's got the epic tone, the big explosions, the fight for your life, war of attrition vibe. All of that was there before Z began. In fact, Goku became an adult prior to Dragon Ball ending in the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai arc. So you can't really say that Z is the story of adult Goku because that story would have begun in Dragon Ball. This was a gradual change that Toriyama made starting right around the middle of Dragon Ball and then into Z and for the remainder of the series. And because this was the original creator's intention, this is why I always group Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z together, because it's all one big series. And this would not be the only time Toei Animation did something like this. Remember Sailor Moon? Sailor Moon had 5 different seasons, 5 major arcs. Sailor Moon R, Sailor Moon S, Sailor Moon Supers, and Sailor Moon Sailor Stars. But the original manga was just Sailor Moon all the way start to finish. Can you imagine if Toei Animation chose to adapt Dragon Ball Z like this? That would mean that every story arc in DBZ would have a different letter attached to it. It would be Dragon Ball F, Dragon Ball C, Dragon Ball B. Who knows, alright? But luckily that didn't happen. At least not until the era of GT, Super, and Daima, but that's a story for another video. We're talking about the birth of Dragon Ball Z here. And I know some people call the Goku at the end of the original Dragon Ball Teen Goku, which is not too terribly far off because he was 18 years old at that time. But when you're 18 years old, you qualify as being an adult, and thus adult Goku was already in the series prior to the series being called Z. We do know, based on documentation that has come out, that originally it was not planned to be called Dragon Ball Z. In fact, there are scripts out there that were recovered from Toei Animation going back to the late 80s that list Dragon Ball Z Episode 1 as Dragon Ball Episode number 154, which means that at one point they considered continuing with the series just being called Dragon Ball all the way through. I'll be honest, I've thought deeply about how different the world would be if it was just Dragon Ball start to finish. How would the video games be marketed? How would the Western perspective of Dragon Ball have changed if people would just accept that it's one big series? That's right, guys. A lot of Dragon Ball fans want to argue that it's not one big series, but it is, especially since it was adapted from a manga that was just called Dragon Ball. These are inarguable facts. However, to be honest, I think it worked out okay. Despite me really wanting some of these people who have never seen Dragon Ball to watch it because you're not getting full context for these characters. You're just not, objectively. And people who skip the original Dragon Ball and just watch the Z part are literally missing a large chunk of the series, almost half of it. However, the reality is that when the series shifts from Dragon Ball to Z, there are a couple of major shift changes in the entire franchise that would stay being centerpieces of the franchise all the way until present day. What I mean by that is that Dragon Ball Z introduces Goku's son Gohan as the second main character, and it gives the huge reveal that Goku was an alien the entire time from a near extinct race of warriors. These two elements, among a few others, would change the makeup of the franchise forever. In 1989, when Toei Animation finally decided to split the series and start the next story arc after the tournament as Dragon Ball Z, at first the show wasn't even called Dragon Ball Z. The guy who came up with the name Dragon Ball Z was Toriyama himself. Prior to that, Toei Animation had several unused titles that thankfully were not what the show would end up being called. The names that were discussed were Dragon Ball 90, because 1990 was almost here at the time, Dragon Ball Gohan's Big Adventure, which is a horrible title, and lastly, Dragon Ball 2. Now, there's the myth that apparently somebody wrote Dragon Ball 2 on a piece of paper and somebody else from Toei thought that it said Z, and that's how the name came up. That's complete and utter BS. That's fake. That never happened. What happened was Toriyama himself came up with the name Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Z, because, quite frankly, he thought the series was coming to an end. He did not think there was much left for him to write about. This quote is from Akira Toriyama himself. He says, "So at the time, I already really wanted to end the series, and so I made the title Z to say, hey, this is the end, with Z being the last letter of the alphabet." What I find so damn funny and ironic is that the beginning of Dragon Ball Z would actually be far from the end. In fact, the part of the series that's considered the Z part of the story is longer than the first Dragon Ball part. Toriyama is a discovery writer, so when he first came up with the name Dragon Ball Z, there was no way that he could have known he would be writing multiple more arcs, introducing more new characters, new aliens, new villains, time travel, magicians, warlocks, and everything in between. He really believed it would not go that long. It went for another 6 years. What I find interesting is that even though Toriyama came up with the name Dragon Ball Z, he never actually used it for the manga at all. It was an idea that Toei Animation first came to Toriyama about, and we're going to get more into that in the next section, because you may be surprised as to what you hear. Before we get to part 2 of this video, this Dragon Ball in-depth on the origin of DBZ, I wanted to quickly share the new merch on the Geekdom 101 store, specifically this incredible 3 pure blood Saiyan piece of merch. You can get it on a shirt, on a hat, various colors and sizes. I am so happy with this design because it's going to represent the 3 most badass characters in the series that are originally from planet Vegeta. Born there, but they weren't all raised there. Goku, Broly, and Vegeta in their most powerful forms. Limited time only. Get your hands on this piece of merch, t-shirt, hat, and there's tons of other things you can purchase on the Geekdom 101 store and tons of other designs. The link will be in the description. Now, let's continue with part 2. Now that we know who came up with the name Dragon Ball Z, we need to look at why this was even done. And what's interesting about this story is it was something that was originally pitched by the manga side of things and not Toei Animation. This goes back to an interview that Toriyama's editor Kazuhiko Torishima had with Forbes magazine where he went into great detail about how he felt about the Dragon Ball anime adaptation. And in this interview, Torishima criticized the original Dragon Ball showrunner Minoru Okazaki, where he basically said that Minoru Okazaki also worked on Dr. Slump and that he felt like Dragon Ball needed a different producer because of the ever-changing tone and how dark the series started to get around the Piccolo arc. Now, the man who worked alongside Okazaki was a man by the name of Daisuke Nishio, who would stick around and produce Dragon Ball Z as well. He would be listed as series director. When you have the position of series director, it's your job to basically put everything together and to manage all the different aspects of the production. So while everybody has their own job, like animation supervisor, sound engineer, etc., as series director, it's your job to oversee all the different departments, and the heads of those departments communicate with them and sign off on big decisions involving the present and future of the show you're working on. Torishima's comments got even more controversial when he praised the production on Saint Seiya, stating that the anime series was a superior production of a mediocre manga. Now look, I've never read the Saint Seiya manga. This is what he said. Don't shoot the messenger. This is what he pitched to Toei Animation, who also produced Saint Seiya. On a personal note, I have seen some episodes of the older anime, and it does look enjoyable and fun. Maybe someday I'll watch the whole thing. There are two very important figures in the history of Dragon Ball that were doing great work on Dr. Slump: Kozo Morishita and Takao Koyama. You've probably heard these names before because they are legendary when it comes to the direction of Dragon Ball Z from the anime side of things. Koyama was already a writer for the Dragon Ball anime before he got this position as head writer, and Morishita became a producer and a series planner and would stick around all the way through GT. Koyama is probably most remembered by the general fandom as being the guy who created all the movie villains, including Broly, alongside Toriyama. These two gentlemen would join the production of Dragon Ball, starting with Dragon Ball episode 133, which is a very important episode. Why? This was the first episode of the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai arc, and the first time that we saw Goku as a fully grown adult. Is it starting to make sense now, ladies and gentlemen? In some ways, if you're aware of this shift in the production, you could make the argument that the Dragon Ball Z era began here, with Goku as an adult, which would lead to Goku, of course, reuniting with Chi-Chi, marrying her, and later on having Gohan. So you could make the argument that Z really started here. That's kind of up to you. I prefer to use the argument that it's Dragon Ball start to finish because that's how it was in the manga. But either way, this was a definitive shift in the direction of the series. And that's not all. When Koyama was brought on board, he started to plan with, of course, Toei Animation, the release of 2 Dragon Ball movies per year. The first one, of course, being the film known as Dead Zone, which in Japan was called Dragon Ball Z the Movie. This film was in production while they were making the 23rd tournament and the early episodes of DBZ. It was his idea to make the movies sort of like side stories. I know some fans call them non-canon because they don't fit in with most of the anime timeline. That's a bit of a deeper discussion, but nevertheless, it's not part of the main anime story. And Koyama most likely did this because of other shows in the 80s, like some of the live-action Toku shows that had these side story movies that worked well, made money, and helped promote the anime. We also need to discuss how filler was used. So for most of the original run of Dragon Ball, there was filler done sort of as small scenes, extra stuff for context, and some lore that was not approved by Toriyama, which caused some contradictions, but nothing too major. When Koyama came in with Morishita, that's when you started having the concepts of having entire arcs be filler, such as the middle of the preparation for Vegeta and Nappa coming, how a lot of that stuff was anime only. Of course, the Garlic Jr. saga and the Otherworld tournament. These were multiple episode filler arcs that were created specifically in times when the anime was coming too close to the manga to prevent the anime story from going past the manga. They would create these arcs, giving Toriyama more time to plan and write out the main story. I don't think a lot of anime fans understand that that is truly the original purpose behind filler. And I know that there's a stigma because of other shows like Naruto that filler is all bad, and I disagree. There is some boring filler, without question, no argument there, in various shows, but a lot of times filler can be pretty cool. It makes the fights longer, in some ways more epic. The dialogue can also be pretty badass, even if it's not from Toriyama, and sometimes you get a few extra bits of lore and some comedy. So I've never been an anti-filler type of dude, but I know a lot of anime fans are, and it just depends. It's very subjective. Some people love filler, some people don't. For me, it depends on what it is. But the point is that during the Z era, the way they looked at filler wasn't quite the same. Also, something else that long-time Dragon Ball fans, especially those that watched it in Japanese, will also pick up on. Remember how the original Dragon Ball had very simple episode titles, usually just a few words or a sentence, with very few two-part titles. When Dragon Ball Z began, every episode, almost every episode, 99% of them, had these two-part titles. Sailor Moon also adopted this. I'll give you an example. Dragon Ball Z episode 30 is called A Hot Unbounded Battle, Goku vs. Vegeta. However, in the original English dub, it was called Goku vs. Vegeta, a Saiyan Duel. That's one of the rare times that Funimation used a two-part title. However, oftentimes they just stuck with one somewhat boring title. I'm a big fan of the double titles because they're so culturally fun and they're so Japanese that when I think of them, I have a big smile on my face because, yeah, some of them do sound a bit much, you know what I mean? But I have a ton of nostalgia for discovering this show through VHS trading and falling in love with little things like the double titles. The point is, Morishita and Koyama were the new blood to change the direction of how the anime did things. Here's the big secret about where Dragon Ball Z really came from. When Kozo Morishita came into the production, he had several meetings with Torishima from Shueisha. And together they discussed a way to sort of do a soft relaunch of Dragon Ball. Morishita's idea was to end the series and then relaunch it as Dragon Ball Z the very next week. No seasonal breaks. You didn't have to wait a year or 6 months. It was 1 week for the show to start with a new name, with more money and a bigger budget to advertise it. This was his strategy of getting Toei Animation to promote this as something new, even though it really wasn't. It was just the next story arc of Dragon Ball. Ultimately, Dragon Ball Z does not exist because the tone changed, or even because Gohan was there, even though that's a very big deal. Dragon Ball Z was called Dragon Ball Z because Morishita wanted to get more money. It's that simple. And since then, Dragon Ball Z really has become the most recognized Dragon Ball brand worldwide. For better or for worse. I, for one, think that the original Dragon Ball does not get the kind of love it deserves, especially from the world of video games, when the majority of the video games start the story at the arrival of Raditz, when that is not the beginning of the Dragon Ball story. I'm not mad about it. I'm used to it. I just wish that they would incorporate more of the OG story into the games so that people would kind of give it a chance, because a lot of fans are ignorant and think that the original Dragon Ball does not matter. And that's wrong. It's literally like watching The Empire Strikes Back without watching the original 1977 Star Wars. You're missing the beginning, and it does matter. So Morishita got that approved, and Dragon Ball Z begun with a new name, a new logo, new music, new intro songs, but still the same characters that we all loved with a few fresh faces. What I find interesting about the story is that it was all about timing. I don't think that Morishita and Koyama really knew what was to come, and they kind of got a good break because after the 23rd tournament, there was that 5-year time skip before the beginning of the Z part with the arrival of Raditz and the introduction of Gohan. And at that time, the 5-year skip was the longest time skip in the story. Think about how wild this is. If Torishima did not speak up when he did, and did not see Saint Seiya when he did, and did not speak to Toei Animation when he did, Dragon Ball Z may have never been what it was. Or maybe it would have started at a later point. But that's a variant timeline that we do not live in. I hope you enjoyed this history lesson. 35 years of Dragon Ball Z. It brought us all together. I'll catch you down the road.